Chapter 1: The Numbers That Changed Everything. In 2025, China signed over $30 billion in construction contracts across Africa. These include railways connecting Nairobi to Mombasa, highways linking Lagos to Kano in Nigeria, and massive port expansions in Abidjan, Tema, and Djibouti. Hydroelectric projects on the Nile, solar farms in Morocco, and gas plants in Nigeria provide critical power for industries that have long struggled under intermittent electricity. At the same time, United States aid to Africa, once nearly $20 billion per year, fell to its lowest level in decades. This dramatic divergence signals a transformation in Africa's economic relationships and challenges the dominance of Western aid models. For more than half a century, African nations followed a familiar script. Western governments provided aid, international financial institutions issued loans, and development was promised, but rarely delivered. Aid often stabilized governments and funded emergency services, yet it seldom built the infrastructure necessary for long-term growth. Roads remained incomplete, railways deteriorated, ports were underutilized, and power shortages crippled domestic industry. China's commitment of $50 billion in financing and nearly $300 billion in annual trade with African countries illustrates a shift from conditional aid to strategic investment. Unlike grants, these projects deliver durable systems that create long-term capacity. Railways, ports, airports, and energy systems are no longer symbolic, they are instruments of sovereignty. Africa is no longer asking for permission to develop. It is charting its own course, asserting agency, and leveraging global partnerships to build its future. The stakes are high. Countries with reliable infrastructure, efficient trade networks, and dependable energy are beginning to outpace those still reliant on aid programs. The numbers tell a story of a continent repositioning itself, a continent moving from dependency to agency, from survival to strategy, from promises to tangible results. Chapter 2: The Limits of Western Aid. To understand Africa's pivot toward alternative partnerships, we must examine the limits of Western aid. After independence, aid was framed as a bridge between colonial extraction and modern development. But over decades, that bridge became a ceiling. Aid often focused on stabilizing budgets, paying salaries, and funding short-term programs, rather than addressing the structural barriers to industrial growth. At its peak in the early 2000s, U.S. aid approached $20 billion annually. Yet during this period, Africa's infrastructure gap widened. Rail systems collapsed, roads remained unpaved, electricity production lagged behind population growth, and domestic industries could not compete with subsidized imports. Aid also came with conditions. Structural adjustment programs required privatization, budget cuts, and market liberalization. These measures often undermined domestic industry, weakened state capacity, and reduced social spending. Governments faced the dilemma of meeting donor requirements or addressing pressing domestic needs. More importantly, aid was unpredictable. Funding fluctuated with U.S. political cycles, shifting military priorities, and crises far removed from African realities. By the 2020s, aid had declined sharply, not because Africa had achieved self-sufficiency, but because the continent had slipped down the Western priority list. This created a dangerous contradiction. Nations were expected to grow, industrialize, and provide employment for millions of young people, but without the infrastructure, capital, or technological base to do so. Aid preserved survival, but it did not produce sovereignty. As a result, African governments began seeking alternative models. A continent rich in resources, talent, and human capital was constrained by decades of conditional, inconsistent, and short-term aid programs. The question became clear: how could Africa build the future it deserved without relying on foreign charity? Chapter 3: China's Infrastructure Strategy. China's approach is fundamentally different. It is not about grants or temporary programs, it is about contracts, projects, and systems that endure. In 2025, Chinese companies signed $30.5 billion in infrastructure contracts across Africa. Projects include railways, highways, ports, airports, and energy facilities, each addressing bottlenecks that have constrained development for decades. Rail projects like the Standard Gauge Railway in Kenya, connecting Nairobi to Mombasa, reduce transit times from days to hours. In West Africa, expanded ports in Lagos, Tema, and Abidjan enable exporters to reach international markets efficiently. Roads linking industrial hubs with production zones reduce costs and make goods more competitive globally. Energy projects are equally transformative. Morocco's Noor Solar Complex, Nigeria's Azura Edo gas plant, and hydropower facilities on the Nile provide reliable electricity to industrial zones. No electricity means no factories, no jobs, and no sovereignty. Reliable energy is the backbone of modern economic growth. China also invests in urban infrastructure, water supply, and logistics hubs, creating systems that support industrialization, trade, and technological adoption. These investments are not temporary, they build durable capacity. Unlike Western aid, which often funds services or programs, China builds systems. Systems endure, creating lasting impact. The result, African nations gain productive capacity, employment, and infrastructure that empowers them to negotiate from a position of strength. Chapter 4: Trade, Technology, and Leverage. Trade is the ultimate measure of influence. Africa-China trade now totals nearly $300 billion annually, far surpassing Africa-US trade. Trade agreements allow African countries to export minerals, agricultural goods, and manufactured products while negotiating technology transfer, local employment, and infrastructure development. This strengthens domestic economies and reduces dependency. China's investments extend into digital infrastructure, fiber optic networks, mobile systems, and data centers power modern economies. Mobile banking, logistics platforms, e-commerce, and automated factories all depend on reliable digital networks. Western aid often funds temporary programs. China builds systems. These systems endure, enhancing state capacity and enabling governments to plan independently. Trade creates leverage. Diversified markets, infrastructure, and digital networks allow African nations to negotiate with traditional powers on equal footing. This pivot, from aid to trade, dependency to agency, is reshaping Africa's global role. Economic empowerment and sovereignty now reinforce each other, enabling a strategic approach to development that is both local and global. Chapter 5: Sovereignty and the Global Power Shift. Africa is not choosing China over the West. Africa is choosing options. This economic pivot aligns with a broader sovereignty movement. The African Continental Free Trade Area reduces dependence on external markets. Regional economic blocs assert control over natural resources. Diplomatic and security partnerships are diversifying. For the first time since independence, African governments negotiate from positions of choice rather than desperation. Western powers, accustomed to influence through aid, are unsettled. When aid is no longer essential, influence must be earned. This is not a rejection of the West. It is a rejection of dependency. By asserting agency, African nations reclaim control over their economic destinies. Trade agreements, infrastructure projects, and technology investments give countries bargaining power and strategic independence. Sovereignty extends beyond politics, it is economic, social, and technological. Reliable infrastructure, trade networks, and digital systems reduce reliance on donors and empower nations to innovate and industrialize. Chapter 6: From Dependency to Agency. China's $50 billion investment and nearly $300 billion trade relationship with Africa represent more than economics, they reflect a shifting world order. Western aid is declining not because Africa has failed, but because African nations are refusing to build their future on dependency. Infrastructure replaces assistance, trade replaces charity, and sovereignty replaces permission. This is not the end of Africa's struggle. Poverty, inequality, and governance challenges remain. But Africa's approach to development is changing. Infrastructure, trade, and technology are tools of self-determination. Ports operate efficiently. Rail networks connect landlocked regions. Energy projects power industries. Digital infrastructure supports knowledge economies. These systems endure, giving governments leverage, independence, and capacity to plan strategically. Africa is no longer a passive recipient of aid, it is a proactive architect of its destiny. Governments negotiate partnerships, manage resources, and assert sovereignty in a multipolar world. If this documentary challenged your assumptions, share your thoughts in the comments. Explore previous episodes to see how Africa's economic awakening connects to a longer history. Africa is not being rescued. Africa is repositioning.